Hello everyone, and welcome to my presentation about gluten-free diets in healthy individuals. So my objectives today are to go over the background of bread and its role as a staple food, and when and if it should be avoided, common misconceptions about bread and gluten, an article review, and some conclusions and recommendations for practice. So some background. Bread has been around for a very long time for humans. Its history dates back to the Fertile Crescent, where the world's first urban cultures were developed. Many consumers are confused about whether or not they should eat bread, and it's recently gained a bad reputation. So the most commonly consumed bread in Western countries is wheat bread, of which gluten is a crucial functional component that traps air and allows bread to rise. Wheat contains essential amino acids, minerals, vitamins, and phytochemicals, and fiber. And if it's not a whole wheat product and we refine it, breads are enriched or fortified with nutrients needed in the diet, such as folic acid and iron, which may have been removed. Consuming whole grains has been shown by multiple studies to reduce the risk of cardiac diseases, total cancer, mortality from all causes, respiratory diseases, infectious diseases, diabetes, and all non-cardiovascular and non-cancer causes. So obviously, if there are different conditions requiring elimination of wheat or gluten in the diet, such as celiac disease, gluten ataxia, which is a neurological disorder, if you're allergic to wheat or gluten, and if GI symptoms are present, such as gluten sensitivity or some patients with irritable bowel syndrome. So some common consumer thoughts. Should I eat bread? So the Consumer Reports National Research Center published in 2014 that 63% of Americans believe that a gluten-free diet could improve their mental or physical health. And up to a third of Americans are cutting back on it in hope that it will improve their health or prevent disease. So they may believe that it's fattening or that it leads to diabetes, can cause foggy thinking or depression, leads to Alzheimer's disease. If it's bad for them, it's bad for me too. So if it's bad for someone with IBS or celiac disease, it must be bad for me as well. And it causes digestive problems. So when I chose an article to review, there were plenty of systematic reviews of general information about the gluten-free diet in healthy individuals, but I wanted to pick something a little more specific and applicable. So I studied the effect of bread gluten content on gastrointestinal function, so the bare bones basics of whether or not we can digest it well. So it was a crossover MRI study in healthy humans, published in the British Journal of Nutrition in 2015. So the study objectives and design, they wanted to compare bread containing gluten and gluten-free bread on gastrointestinal function and volumes in the gastrointestinal tract in healthy individuals using an MRI study and a questionnaire at the end about symptoms. It was a randomized mechanistic open label crossover study. Participants were studied on 3 separate days, 1 week apart, so they were at home. They were given one of 3 breads, and it was a crossover study, so the breads were given to different participants at different times. One of the breads was gluten-free, one was of normal gluten content, and one had added gluten content, and these were breads that were purchased already and frozen, so that each batch was the same that was given to each participant. The subjects were 12 healthy subjects aged 18 to 55 with an equal distribution of male and female subjects with normal BMI. They were healthy. Anyone that had any GI issues or any diseases related to the GI function were excluded. Equal bread portions were consumed at home 2 times a day with jam, margarine, and orange juice. They required finishing the meal within 15 minutes of starting. That's all they ate. And they underwent a postprandial scan and used a system questionnaire after they were done. So the results of this study showed, using an MRI, that in the stomach, the gluten-free bread was a more homogeneous bolus in the stomach, occupying almost the whole stomach, whereas the gluten-free the gluten breads, the one with added gluten and the regular one, showed a darker mass with more liquid. There was no significant difference in emptying time. So when the bolus moved to the small bowel, there was a similar rise in water content in all 3 meals. So that wasn't significant at all. As for colonic volumes, there was a significantly higher facet transverse colonic volume in the gluten-free bread, which was interesting, although the total regional volumes were similar. So in the symptoms questionnaire, there were no postprandial differences reported by the subjects between the meals for fullness, hunger, desire to eat, flatulence, bloating, abdominal pain, or diarrhea, which would all be symptoms of intolerance. So increasing the gluten content of the study meal increased the fundal chyme heterogeny, and the stomach can ultimately compensate for differing physical properties to minimize their influence on gastric emptying. So some strengths and limitations for this study that I found. So strengths included, they did use the same batch of bread loaves. They made sure they bought them all at one point and then froze them. They blinded evaluators, like those participating operating the MRI. They were building on a previous hypothesis or study they had. So their original study had to do with gastric emptying. And their original hypothesis was that increasing gluten content will increase gastric content viscosity, leading to less rapid breakdown of bread structure and hence greater heterogeny and delayed gastric emptying, possibly explaining the bloating and other symptoms some people report. This wasn't exactly proven, but they are building on it. They did control for pre-existing conditions. So they did exclude candidates with a history of pre-existing GI disorder, previous resection of any GI tract sections, including the appendix or the gallbladder, contradictions for MRI scanning, taking any gut motility altering drugs, antibiotic or probiotic treatment in the past 4 weeks, and inability to lie flat for the MRI scanner. Also, night shift workers were excluded and overweight people were excluded. And those who were participating in strenuous exercise greater than 10 hours a week in the past 3 months. So they did control pretty well, and they had a well-distributed cohort. No conflicts of interest were reported, and the only funding they received was academic funding. So there was no real conflict of interest there. Some cons for this study were they had a very small sample size, and they also didn't meet their planned sample size of 18, so they ended up with 12. A lot of their participants didn't show up to the first day of the study, so they had to eliminate a lot of their participants. This was also an open label study, so the participants were aware of which bread they were receiving. And it was some self-reported symptoms. So this may have been a drawback depending on any bias that the subject had. There was also some talk about freezing the bread, altering the structure a little bit. which may have altered the results, although that's not very significant. And the bread meals were prepared at home, so that wasn't necessarily a controlled environment, although, again, there were no significant findings related to that. So some conclusions and future applications of this study and topic. So there are medical reasons and specific reasons to avoid gluten in the diet. We don't necessarily need to avoid it as of now with the current research if we don't have these medical reasons. As always, choosing foods with the least additives at the store or making homemade bread or homemade foods are the best choices because we know exactly what's in those. There was found to be no association between gluten presence in bread and digestive difficulty in healthy adult studies, so we are able to digest this. Wheat is a healthy whole grain, a staple of our diet, and is usually enriched with vitamins and minerals that may be lacking in our diet otherwise. Gluten-free products are just expensive and not doable for everybody. And we would benefit from some further research in this area, more specifically about gluten-free products and weight, or gluten-free products and nutritional adequacy, or risk of diabetes that would help us make a more well-rounded recommendation. And these are my references. Thank you very much.